One of the brilliant things about digital photography is that we can get instant feedback about the images that we've just taken. In the days of film, we'd have to run off the entire film, send it away, and maybe 2 weeks later see what the results of our mistakes were. But now we can actually look at the back of the camera and see the results of each image as we take them if we need to. Now, I wouldn't recommend looking at the actual image on the back of your camera to establish whether it's correctly exposed or not, because there's too many variables. It's not a high enough quality sort of monitor to actually give you that sort of feedback. But what I would suggest is that you use the histogram, which is a graphical representation of the tonal distribution of brightness within the image. Now, this is really useful, and it doesn't rely on the fact that you need to set the back of the screen to the right brightness or anything. It just gives it a straight tonal distribution of each image. So we need to understand these histograms so we can make best use of it in our photography when we're taking the pictures and when we go into Photoshop or Camera Raw to adjust these images later on. So a digital photograph is made up of individual coloured squares called pixels or picture elements. And if we start zooming into this picture of a red kite, we can see that the red kite's eye is made up of lots and lots of little square colours. And we can zoom in further until we get down to a little square grid of 9 pixels here. And if we look at the central one, we can see that that's actually made up of 3 different colours, red, green and blue. And each of those has its own particular value. Now, if each one of these was exactly the same number, it would be a shade of grey. But because there are different numbers here, then it has a slight colour within it, and you can see it's a sort of greeny grey colour. So a digital photograph and in image processing, it's all about capturing and then controlling the way these individual pixels are displayed to create what we consider to be the desired image, and the histogram helps us in this regard. So here we have a typical scene, and on the back of the camera we have access to a histogram. The same image within Adobe Camera Raw, we have a histogram. Same image within Photoshop, we can access the histogram. And if we look at the histogram in each one of those, they're all showing an identical distribution of tones. That one's a luminance only, which means black and white. All the channels are combined. This is color and this is color. So each color channel, red, green and blue, is separated out, but they all produce the same peak levels and distribution of tones. Okay, so they all say the same thing. So a histogram is a graphical representation of the tonal values within an image. It's a bar graph, and it can be used as an aid for determining the correct exposure, color and tonal range in an image. Okay. So for certain graphs we have what's called the luminance, which is a combination of all the brightness levels of all the 3 color channels. And the color image is comprised of our 3 color channels, red, green and blue. Okay, so if we were to produce some graphs here, red, green and blue channels, and we were to look at the red channel here of that 1 pixel, it's got a number here of 165. Okay, so that means, and this is talking about an 8-bit image, so all of these are illustrated in 8 bits, even though you may be using a 16-bit image in Photoshop or in Camera Raw, they always show it in as an 8-bit representation here. So that particular number would be represented on this bar chart 165 divisions along. Okay, the green 170 along. If you wish to count up, you may feel free to do so. And the blue there. Okay, so we could start to populate each of our graphs with a pixel, and that represents 1 pixel there, 1 pixel there, and same again there. Okay, so we've now got a bar graph of one little lump there, showing that 1 pixel. Now if that 1 pixel, say there's 10 of them with exactly the same amount of values, then each one of those would be increased. And you can imagine that happening for every different pixel across the entire image, each building up to produce a chart. So each image pixel populates the histogram in the same way, using its own red, green and blue values. So we may end up with a histogram populated and showing a graph like that as they're all blended together. So this histogram again represents luminance, brightness values only. So we've got a combination of all red, green and blue values mixed together to give just the total brightness of all 3 channels. Now then, if we have a sharp peak on the left hand side, that means that there are lots and lots of pixels that are pure black, which means it's clipped and there's no tonal values other than black in lots and lots of pixels. So generally that's a thing to avoid. It means you might have the exposure on, and we say it's clipped. Conversely, if we have a sharp peak on the right hand side, the very right hand side, it means that we've got lots and lots of pure white pixels, and again we've got lots of clipped pixels, and that could be another indication that we've got the exposure wrong. Similarly, if we've got a sharp rise like this to the left, it could indicate, and I say could, that we've got the whole image totally underexposed, especially if we've got a sharp peak on the far left hand side. Conversely, if it's all shifted across to the right hand side, and especially if we've got a sharp peak here, it means that the image is probably overexposed, it's too light. So we can use these histograms to get a feel for the exposure correctness in our image. Now this image here, it looks fairly bright on the screen, but if we look at the histogram, okay, there's no deep blacks or anything, but it goes up to a peak here. Everything seems shifted to the right hand side, but there isn't a sharp peak on the right hand side. So that means that the sensor has captured all of the tonal range, although it's shifted to the right. All of the tonal range within that image has been captured successfully by the sensor, because there isn't a peak on the right hand side or the left hand side. And this is a good example of exposing to the right. So that because of the linear nature of digital capture, it's always best to have the right hand side of the histogram fully populated without clipping. That way you get the best tonal range. In this example, it's been underexposed. You can see the whole histogram shifted to the left, and there's a huge peak on the left hand side, which means that there's lots and lots of pure blacks. We know we don't even need to look at the picture on the back of the camera. We just look at the histogram and think that is not right. And this is 2 stops underexposed. Again, we could go the other way, so make it brighter, and we can see that the entire histogram is shifted over to the right, and I've got a huge peak on the right hand side. Lots and lots of pure white pixels, meaning it is severely clipped, and that is incorrectly exposed. Here we can see that the pixels are all shifted into the middle, the values. There's nothing to the right, nothing to the left, everything is in the middle area, and we can look at the picture and think that hasn't got any contrast in it. It's too flat, and our histogram shows that graphically. There's no brightness, there's no darkness, it's just all the midtones. Okay. This sort of image would be fairly easy to sort out in Adobe Camera Raw or Photoshop. So the image lacks contrast. Conversely, here we've got a huge peak on the left and a huge peak on the right, and all the histogram is spread out, so it's far too contrasty. the histogram is showing us that graphically. Here we have an example where the histogram is broken down into the 3 colour channels, and again we've got a peak on the left on all 3 colour channels, indicating there's quite a bit of burnt out snow and sky area. You might get away with it with an image like this. So let's just have a look at some typical kind of histograms that you might come across. Now this is almost a perfect histogram, almost a nice sine wave here. So we've got no peaks on the left, no peaks on the right, and a nice curve representing all the tonal values in the image. This image here, we have several peaks representing the different brightness areas. So we've got lots of brightness around here. That's probably represented by this here. We've got some quite dark areas here. That'll be represented back here. Okay, so you can start to understand, start to appreciate where these peaks are and the general tones within the image. Okay, so we've got lots of fairly dark tones here, all around here. That's probably going to be that peak there. In this image, we've got quite a lot of dark areas. This is a scan of a slide, so there was no detail in this at all. And we've got a huge peak to the left. You can't do anything about it. But the rest of the tones look okay. And we go into, you can see it. We have got some tones right up here, and that'll be representing the cloud areas there. All this grass and concrete, they're all similar sort of tones. This will all be the mid-tone area there. Again, another very contrasty image. There's no peak on the right hand side, so we've managed to keep all the brightness in, but we've let all this area here go to silhouette, hence the peak on the left. So all this is clipped, but for an image like this, that doesn't matter. That's the effect that we're after. But so long as we've got a nice distribution of other tones, we haven't clipped the highlights, that's the effect we're after. So that again is a nice tonal curve for that particular type of image. Another very dark image, so you naturally expect most of the tones to be peaked or stacked over to the left. And again, it looks correctly exposed. So don't just think a histogram has got to be a nice sine wave in the middle. It depends on the content of the image. Here we have what looks quite a nice picture, but everything is shifted over to the right. That is the nature of this particular image. It's supposed to be a sort of high key image. There's no peaking on the far right, so we know that we haven't clipped any highlights. But we've got tones all the way through. We wouldn't want the histogram to move all the way back to the left into the blacks, because it would remove this bright quality of the image. This image here, most of the tones are towards the center, but when you look at it, we do have a little bit of pure highlight and some darks down here. So again, that is probably the correct contrast and exposure for that particular image. Okay, so there are no hard and fast rules for this. That you use the histograms as a guidance. And again, this is another one of these rather low contrast image, but that's the appeal of, well, I feel it's the appeal of this particular image. We've got the sails here, almost white, represented by the little peak here. Most of the image is in the center because it's a sort of hazy day, and that's the effect that we're after. We wouldn't want a great big load of pixels on the left hand side, the darks and the blacks, because it would get rid of that hazy day sort of feeling. Okay, so hopefully from that you can begin to appreciate how to interpret a histogram, and there is no set fixed type of histogram. They all change depending on the subject matter, and it's just a matter of trying to interpret the subject matter to the histogram. Does it all kind of match up, and have you got the exposure right? This is how you can achieve that.